My name is Ellie Finkelstein. I'm the campaigner and news editor at Freedom United, a global anti-modern slavery community. We make modern slavery an issue that people can see and solve, raising awareness and turning that awareness into action to build power for change for a world resilient to exploitation. Today, we're discussing a perhaps lesser-known form of modern slavery, orphanage trafficking, where children are recruited, sometimes separated from their families, and institutionalized, not for care, but exploited for profit. I'm speaking from Canada, where the intergenerational harm of forced institutionalization of Indigenous children through the residential school system is still deeply felt across Canadian society today. Generations of children were taken from their families, communities, and cultures and placed into church and state-run institutions where many suffered profound neglect, abuse, and cultural erasure. This history is not just Canada's. Around the world today, children are being removed from their roots, family, language, tradition, and home, under a disturbingly familiar narrative of help and charity. As one of our panelists, Ruth Washuka, movingly said in a conversation we had yesterday, after watching the film Volunteers Needed, she found herself wishing there were a Reroute Nepal, an organization like the one she founded, Reroute Africa, where children who have been disconnected from their families and culture could begin the process of healing and return. That desire points to a painful truth. This issue is not limited to one country or one region. It's global. This conversation is happening at an intentional moment, the end of Child Abuse Prevention Month in the US. To mark this month, we partnered with Volunteers Needed, an unreleased award-winning documentary exposing the orphanage trafficking industry. You were given exclusive access to this film as part of our campaign to amend the US Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPRA, to recognize orphanage trafficking as a form of modern slavery. Now, why does this matter? Every day, children are trafficked into institutions to attract donations and volunteer placements. 80% of children in orphanages have at least one living parent. Families are deceived with false promises, while traffickers profit from children's exploitation. The US plays a major role in sustaining this system through study abroad programs, faith-based initiatives, nonprofits, volunteerism, and more. Many unknowingly support this harmful industry, thinking they're helping. But the TVPRA is a key US anti-trafficking law that does not currently recognize orphanage trafficking as a form of modern slavery. That gap means organizations can support these institutions without legal accountability, and we're here to change that. Now allow me to introduce today's moderator and panelists. Martin Punax, who will be moderating today's discussion, is an international child protection expert with 25 years of experience, including pioneering anti-orphanage trafficking work with Next Generation Nepal. He collaborates with governments, NGOs, international organizations, companies, and grassroots movements. Bhushan Dahal is a PhD candidate in education policy at FSU and a key figure in rebuilding Nepal's education infrastructure post the devastating 2015 earthquake. He has improved learning for 6,000 children across 11 public schools. As director of Kids of Kathmandu and country representative for Global Dignity, he champions dignity in education and was featured in the UN documentary called Nepal, Rebuilding After the Earthquake. Barak Laub is the director and producer of Volunteers Needed, a documentary exposing the hidden harms of orphanage volunteerism and its links to child trafficking. With nearly 2 years of experience in South Asia, he brings deep insight into global child protection. He has a background in behavioral economics and political science, and beyond filmmaking, is also a professional cartographer, educator, and outdoorsman. Ruth Washuka is a globally recognized expert and advocate for care reform. In 2019, she founded Reroute Africa, a platform rooted in justice, which raises awareness on orphanage trafficking and modern slavery that works to reclaim identity, dignity, and culture for people separated from their families. She also serves as the director of the African Network of Care Leavers, a Pan-African movement that champions survivor-led leadership in policy change and systems transformations. With lived experience of institutional care, she now uses her experience to challenge the narratives and systems that exploit children under the guise of care. As a survivor of orphanage trafficking, she believes in legislation as a tool for justice, and her voice continues to shift policy and global discourse around modern slavery and care reform. We'll start with a quick poll to get to know our audience, followed by a panel discussion, and then open the Q&A. The Q&A might go over the hour, so please stick around if you can. If you didn't pre-submit a question, feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you're posting online, please tag us at Freedom United HQ. Now we're going to begin with a poll. It should now appear on your screen, so please take a moment to respond. Thank you for taking the time to respond. I'll now pass it over to Martin Punax to lead today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Ellie, and thank you very much to everyone at Freedom United for hosting this important event today. I'm very happy to be here. So good afternoon, good evening, everybody around the world. It's good to see so many people here. Before we move on to our speakers, I just want to say a few words about the film itself. Have you all seen the film? I sincerely hope you have seen it. It's a brilliant film, and I'll tell you why I think it's such a brilliant film in just a moment. Before I do that, I just want to start by saying a few words about this issue more generally, as someone who is a child protection professional working in this area. So there are about 5.4 million children in the world who are living in orphanages, or to use the more technical term, they're living in institutions or institutional care. There's about 80 to 90 years of really good quality research now showing why it's incredibly harmful for children to grow up in institutional care or to grow up in orphanages. And there are some very, very strong international laws and frameworks which make it very clear that countries should not be placing children in institutional care. Instead, they should be doing everything they possibly can so that children can grow up in families. And if it's not possible for them to grow up with their own parents, they should grow up with extended family members. And if that's not possible, they should grow up in what we call family-based alternative care, so things like foster care or kinship care and so on. And the reality is that the vast, vast majority of children who are living in so-called orphanages around the world could be living in families. They could be living with their parents or extended family members, or indeed in foster care, in line with international law and indeed many national laws as well. And the transition that's needed to help children get there is known as deinstitutionalization, and it involves states or countries putting in lots of resources into services that support families and help families so that children aren't separated. And you might be thinking, well, where's the money going to come from to do that? Well, there have been a number of really important and significant financial analyses which have looked at the amount of money around the world that's going into institutions and orphanages. And the truth is that that money, if it was transitioned towards supporting family services and family policies and so on, could support children and families many times over. So it's not due to lack of money. One of the reasons that children are still living in orphanages in countries like Nepal and many countries around the world is because there are often financial incentives for people to keep them there, which is what Barak's film is all about. And as a child protection professional, I think we sometimes struggle in the child protection sector trying to explain this issue to people who don't work in our area. We find it hard to communicate it well. And the reason that I think that Barak's film is really, really good is that I think he does that brilliantly. I think all of us can relate to those volunteers that are shown in the film who, with good intentions, they went to Nepal, they wanted to help children. They meant well, they even paid so they could help children, and yet they were tricked, they were scammed, and inadvertently they were actually causing harm. They were creating the incentive for those children to be unnecessarily separated from their families, and that's why I think this is such an important film. So we're going to explore those issues in a bit more detail now with our three speakers, and I'm going to start with Ruth. Hello, Ruth. It's good to have you here. So, Ruth,
Thank you, Martin.
You and I have worked together for many years on this issue now, and I always enjoy working with you. You have one thing, though, that I don't have. which is that you have direct experience of having grown up in an orphanage where volunteers were coming and trying to care for you when you were a child. And that's really significant experience. As well as that, though, you are now a professional, you're an international activist, you travel around the world raising awareness of these issues, and you're, one of the global experts, I would say, in this area. So my question for you, Ruth, to get us started is, what patterns have you observed in how the good intentions of volunteers and NGOs can lead to children being harmed in the way the film shows, and you've personally experienced as well?
Thank you very much, Martin. I think from my own observation, personally and professionally, volunteers don't just arrive in orphanages, they create the demand for them. Because by visiting the orphanages, they are either coming to spend their time, they are giving money, and it all believe that they are supporting the children. But what this actually does, because they are well intentioned, but not well informed, what this does is that they fuel the entire supply chain by creating a demand. The more time they offer, the more money they give, it creates a demand and more children are recruited into the orphanage. And I do think that honestly, Martin, the problem is in the name because the name orphanage often it gives a notion of security, it gives a notion of care and rescue. But we know that that is not the case. Majority of survivors of institutional care or even orphanage trafficking know that this meant, disconnection. You have been disconnected from your family. There is loneliness and there is abuse. So for me, if you ask, I would say they are usually people well intended visiting orphanages to spend a time because they think they are doing the actual thing, the actual work. And the reason they're doing this is because the orphanage by itself gives a notion that we need to rescue babies or we are rescuing babies and we need to help them. And there's also the reinforcement that orphanages care for orphans, which in real sense, that is not the case. So by having visitors visiting different care centers. In my case, we were made to sing, we were meant to, wear tattered clothes just to seek sympathy. And I can remember many times that we had to be paraded when visitors arrive and would sing very spiritual, manipulative songs that, Jesus wants us to support orphans, Jesus wants us to help. And what that meant is that people would give more money. And the more they're giving, the more the demand. So we would have traffickers recruiting children into the orphanage because they know that by bringing more children, we are going to get money. And sometimes the child traffickers are giving a commission for every child you bring, you get money out of it. So the more visitors an orphanage attracts, it means that the more children the orphanage needs. So volunteers and NGOs who are doing this, they are literally leading to commodification of children because we are using them as business. For every one child I have, I'm going to get this X amount of money. And at its core, for sure, this is trafficking and it has to be recognized for what it is.
Thank you very much, Ruth. You explained that really well, the supply and demand side of it, that if volunteers are coming, regardless of what their intentions are, and we know that they're usually very good intentions, they're creating the demand, which means that traffickers then need to supply the children. I think you've explained that really well. And the other point I wanted to pick up on what you said is about the name orphanages, that in many cases, just because an organisation is called an orphanage doesn't mean the children are orphans. More often than not, in the vast majority of cases, they have parents alive. And even if they don't, there's other family members that could be caring for them, or they could be living in foster care or other types of family-based care. So, and indeed, if an organisation is called a children's home, it doesn't mean that that's okay either. We shouldn't go by the names. They're all forms of harmful institutional care. And perhaps we can talk a bit more about that later. So great. Thank you very much, Ruth. It's really good to have you here. So now I'm going to go on to speak with Barak. So Barak, first of all, congratulations on the film. I think it's a really monumental film for the reasons I've said and many more reasons too. It's also the fact you filmed it 10 years ago makes me look 10 years younger. So, that's always a plus. I'm always happy when someone can do that. But joking aside, on a much more serious point, there's one point in the film which is towards the end of the film, and every time I see this bit, it sends a shiver down my spine. And it's when you say that it took you 8 months to figure out that this was a problem. I mean, you're an intelligent guy, you've traveled all over the world, you're very worldly wise, and yet it took you 8 months to figure this out, that what was happening about the trafficking, about the scam that was taking place, and how these children were being abused and so on. Now, a lot of people don't, they never do figure this out. That's the thing. You were one of the ones who did figure out. Many volunteers come and go, they have no idea that what they're involved with. My question to you is, why is this scam so effective? Why don't people figure it out? And what can we all do to make other people aware and stop supporting unnecessary institutionalization and orphanages?
Thanks, Martin. Yeah. So I think really the main reason it took so long, and it wasn't necessarily just to understand something was rotten. It was that we all have this integrated idea that helping orphans is pretty much the highest thing you can do. It's the best thing you can do. And I didn't go to Nepal to look at orphanages. As if you watch the film, you know, I went there kind of to make a travel documentary. And the first time we interviewed someone and we found out they were in a home with trafficked children, you know, our initial thought was, wow, you know, you chose the wrong orphanage. There's hundreds of others you could have chosen and you could have helped all those kids. And I think the more we started digging into it, the more we realized, okay, this isn't just one orphanage, you know, this is a bunch of orphanages. And then wait a second, maybe there's more to this problem. You know, the number 80% of kids in orphanages aren't really orphans is so staggering. And there is such a lingering part of me trying to find the good ones, you know, oh, but there are these ways that people, if they would have just found the right one, they could have helped. And I think it really took that full amount of time being in Nepal, talking to the so-called orphans and the children, as well as the volunteers, to realize this just isn't a good process. This isn't helping anybody except the people who are trafficking children. And as Ruth mentioned, you know, family-based care is the standard in every Western country, in every wealthy modern country. We do foster homes, which have their own problems, and I've volunteered with CASA, which works with foster youth in the U.S. But those problems are significantly less than the orphanage industry. And so when you look that the orphanage industry pretty much solely exists in order to make money, not to actually help children, that's what probably took me the whole time of focusing on.
Thank you, Barak. You explain that really well. That there's a saying we often say in the world of child protection that there's no such thing as a good orphanage. That I think you really highlight that point that volunteers sometimes say, "Okay, so that one's one of the bad ones, but show me one of the good ones, and I'll volunteer there instead." And in reality, unless you are a professional working in this area and you really know the background to those children, you've really done your research, you've carried out assessments, you've looked into their backgrounds, you don't know. We just don't know where those children have come from in many cases and whether they've been trafficked there or not. And even in a situation where children haven't been trafficked, there still shouldn't be unqualified volunteers going to those orphanages. It wouldn't be allowed in the UK where I come from, or in the US where you come from. So yeah, you highlight that really, really well. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to move on now to, oh, actually, one more thing, just Barak, just about what can we do to make people aware of this issue? What more can we do to stop people supporting orphanages? Before I move on to you, Prashan.
Yeah, the big thing is talking to people about it. Everyone I've met knows somebody who's volunteered in an orphanage or at least donated at a minimum. In the US, I think over 4 million people have gone personally to orphanages, and something like 10 times the amount have donated to it. And
Mm.
even today, when I talk to people, they say, "Oh, you wouldn't believe it. You know, my brother, 65-year-old guy, retired, just went and did all this great work in this country." Um, Starting to have this conversation of bringing up these key points about, you know, you're not a professional, you shouldn't be working with children, what things are required. And then anyone who you know who might be in a position to tell other people, bring it up. You know, mention you just saw this documentary. Feel free to link to us, to Freedom United. What's really kind of scary about this is that we know this is an issue. We've known it's an issue for 10 years. The United States, the Secretary of State knows it's an issue. They have it on their website. There's just no regulation around it. So even though we all know it's wrong and you shouldn't be doing it, it's still completely legal to run a profit-making entity which makes money off of commodifying children. And once people start to have that conversation and realize that though it's wrong, it is legal, they may start to grow and learn from it a little bit.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Bharat. Great points made. I'm going to move on to Bhushan now from Nepal. So namaste, Bhushan. It's great to have an expert here from Nepal itself to be able to speak on behalf of the country we're talking about today. So we know that one of the reasons in Nepal and indeed Kenya, where Ruth comes from, in many countries, why children are often trafficked to orphanages is because there isn't access to a school in their village where they come from, or the quality of the education isn't so good, or it's just not perceived to be good. Sometimes it is very good, but it's often not perceived to be good. And I know that the work that you're doing in Nepal is you're really trying to address those drivers that drive orphanage trafficking. You are actually building schools and improving the education system in Nepal. Going back to what we were saying earlier about family services, you're helping improve those services for families so that they don't allow their children to go with traffickers to a fake orphanage effectively. Can you tell us more about your work and how you see it affecting orphanage trafficking and the demand for orphanages in Nepal?
Absolutely. Namaste, Martin. Again, like apps, this is such a beautiful story already laid out here. Uh, I'll just give a background on. So I'm working with an organization called Kids of Kathmandu, and we have, from 2010 to roughly 2018, 2019, we work very closely with several orphanages. One thing that was very clear was, I think Ruth mentioned it, like the orphanage word and who are orphan, like are they real orphan, are they semi-orphan, are they financial orphan, or, there were like several cases where people were bringing kids from the financially, I mean, concerned family and like bring them to an orphanage and they become this sellable commodity in terms of donations, so on and so forth. And 2015, we have an earthquake that happened in Nepal, which actually led us to think that, there was already a problem. Now there's an earthquake. Only thing for kids and family that was important is education. Now that foundation is gone. So the chances of this amplifying is much higher. That's where we said, why don't we solve the root cause, and again, we always ask this question on, do you want to do good or do you want to feel good? If you want to feel good, you can say that, we're helping orphanages or the orphan kids on whatever capacity. We are sending them to school, giving them food, da 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 da. But if you really want to do good, let's try to solve the root problem, which is like go back to the community where the kids are coming from, lay a foundation for education. With building schools, it also gives employment to the people that will generate money to their family. With good education, that would spread around the community and eventually the problem is solved. So that is what we started, Martin. We said that, why don't we go to this rural community and not just like rebuild a school, because in a lot of places school is like, this 4 wall, 1 door, 1 window, a whiteboard, and that's boom, that's the school. We're like, no, I mean, it's beyond that. Why don't we design school which is like more of a school which is beautiful in design, where like teachers know what they are teaching. There is a library which is functional where they can read story. There's a computer lab where they can learn more about technology. And just like, why don't we use this crisis as an opportunity, and again, I'm repeating myself, but like actually solve the root cause, which is making the foundation of education strong, so eventually this problem is solved. That's what we have been doing, Martin. Till now, we have built 11 schools, and we don't build school in major cities. We try to go to the rural communities where, again, there is so many limitation constraints are there, and work from there. And we start with building school, but also work with a lot of trainings, like information sessions, so on and so forth. Yeah, that's what we are doing, Martin.
Right. I'm going to play devil's advocate and ask you a slightly difficult question here, Bhushan.
Absolutely.
I know that when a lot of volunteers come to Nepal, or indeed other countries as well, or donors that are supporting orphanages, they sometimes say, yeah, but the villages are so poor, the conditions there are so bad, it's too difficult for the parents to look after their children. They're much better in an orphanage in Kathmandu, where they can get better resources and so on. What do you say to people when they put that to you? Do you think the villages are bad places? Do you think children shouldn't grow up there?
Look, I mean, there's limitations in the village, right? Like in terms of like, do we get the quality of education? Like, do we have an infrastructure? Do we have a health service that is compared to the urban setting? No, we have to be honest about it. But the fundamental thing that the kids need is their family, is their community, is like this sense of belonging, right? And if we take that out, I mean, what are we leaving the kids with? Yes, there might be a better education opportunity, there might be a better infrastructure, but if you take the dignity out of kids at that age, I mean, we're living with nothing there. uh, so yeah, I mean, it might make sense, but no, it does not make sense.
No, thank you. And I completely agree with you that going back to what I was saying earlier about the evidence, all the evidence shows that children need families, they need a love of a family. That's what's going to help them grow and develop in a healthy way. And also the point about the money, that take the money out of the orphanages and the institutions, give it to the villages, help you build more schools, help Nepal's health service be able to support those children, support those families, support the villages. Don't put it in orphanages. Help the children and the families stay together. So yeah, no, thank you, Prashan, and thank you for all the amazing work that you're doing in Nepal to try and tackle this. I'm going to come back to you now, Ruth. So you've been campaigning on this issue for many, many years now. You're a voice on the international circuit. You attend lots of conferences. You work with policymakers and governments and so on. Are you seeing any changes in terms of what's happening, in terms of policies and what NGOs are doing, in awareness amongst tourists and volunteers? Are things getting any better? And I'm interested both internationally and in terms of your country, Kenya, where this is also a problem, it's also a challenge.
Kenya is a good place to start with, so I like the question. Yes, definitely yes. I have seen serious changes, and I'm really proud to be coming from Kenya, the country where there is momentum, where children are now going back to families. So we have seen government commitments. And we have like the National Care Reform Strategy and national frameworks that are supporting children to now move away from institutions back to families. So first, the government's commitment is quite commendable because there is the recognition that every child requires a family, and the best place for a child to be is in a family. So that shows our government is serious on the work. But of course, we know that that is not enough. We need to see the implementation and the actual move of children being reunited and reintegrated to their families. But that's not still enough. There has to be support for children to remain in those families because, again, we know there's potential for them to come back. So that is one, which is good progress. Internationally, for sure, I do think that yes, in 2023 we had the Interparliamentary Union pass a landmark resolution recognizing the role of parliamentarians on what they really can do on orphanage trafficking, which is addressing it at the legislative level. A good start because we had over 100 countries passing the resolution, but is that enough? Now, this is where I come to part number two, that yes, there is what is happening globally. There is the progress in Kenya. There's also a growing momentum and more people are becoming more curious. And there is, as you know, we have had many people talking about this and people with lived experience coming to the forefront, but it's still not enough. And the reason I say it's not enough is because we cannot just say that just because we are now moving away from institutional care to families, then we are addressing orphanage trafficking. Because deinstitutionalization or transforming the care system, it's not an event. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take years. And as we are doing this for every single day we are waiting, there's a child being trafficked and into an orphanage. So there is need for us to explicitly recognize orphanage trafficking for what it is and not just say that it can be overshadowed by the care reform strategy. We have to name it because we cannot change what we cannot name. We have to name things for us to change them. So we have to recognize it first, that the orphanage trafficking is a form of modern slavery. And then after that, we need to legislate because we cannot offer justice to children without an accountability. And this has to be backed by government commitments, and we have to back these bylaws. So yes, there is progress. It's not enough. We need as many opportunities. And I loved what Barak said. We need to keep talking about it. We need people with lived experience to also be part of the platforms where we can create this awareness. But at the same time, as long as we are not legislating this, then everything else becomes just suggestions and stories. And we don't want to just have stories and not back that up with real commitment. It's not, orphanage trafficking is really a justice issue. It's not a charity. And the moment we shift our focus to looking at it as this really a justice issue, it's not how much I can give to an orphanage, it's how much I want to educate people. Because allow me to say that we don't have a problem of resources. I do think that globally, it's having resources going to the wrong systems, and that is the orphanage systems. So systems that are separating children. But if we could redirect those resources to better support children and back that up with law, then we are close towards getting justice for children. So yes, real commitments have to be backed up, and Kenya should be one of those. That care reform and moving is not enough, but we have to explicitly name orphanage trafficking, recognize it, and legislate. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you also for just shining a light on the fact that this is a problem in Kenya. And I think the conversations we've had, you've been all over the world, and I know that you've seen this problem in many other countries. In fact, when we were talking earlier, just before the event today, you were talking about Barak's film, and you said, "Look, I relate to this. This could be the film made about Kenya." So that's really interesting, and I think really important for people to hear. So it sounds like there is progress being made, but there's still more to be done. We need to properly recognise orphanage trafficking. Just this is an issue that Barak's already touched on. I'd love to hear your view as well. What would you, for all the people that are here today from all over the world, what would you like to see them do as a result of this event today? Any thoughts? Ruth, have we still got you? Ruth?
Sorry, I lost you for a minute.
No problem, no problem. All I was
Yeah,
going to say
could you
was,
ask again? Yeah.
yeah, no problem at all. It's fine. Just saying that you really outlined about there's lots of progress being made, which is great. More needs to be done. Barak already talked a little bit about what people could do to themselves in terms of people here today. Have you got any other thoughts on what people here today from all over the world, that what they could do to help with the kind of work you're doing and that governments are doing to tackle this issue? Is it about awareness? Is it anything else they could do?
Yeah, I think we do need to support organizations in the work that's already ongoing on supporting children to grow in families. Because when we educate ourselves better, we know better. We know that children require those families, but also recognition without resources is not enough. So we do need to support those efforts. But at the same time, we also need to participate in, especially like now, we do want to see that we can legislate this. How can we sign petitions to ensure that globally, we are adding our votes to petitions that are calling for criminalization of orphanage trafficking? There is that, but there's also, organizations, if we're able to have many learning opportunities that we can do this and create awareness, but also for organizations with technical expertise in supporting governments to do this. I have learned over time that once if an issue it's government led, it becomes very easy because there's less resistance. Of course, we do want to educate the volunteers, because there is also a risk that the way we communicate to volunteers and NGOs and people giving their money, if this is not done carefully, then we risk children suffering. And so we are not going to achieve what we want by the end of the day. How do we ensure that we communicate this to the donors and volunteers? How do we educate them on ethical volunteering in a way that they don't just pull back and hold resources? Because majority of them get upset. They feel they've been scammed for years, but it's only that they didn't understand properly. And even as we are changing the orphanage system, the reality is that we have children that have to survive today and tomorrow for them to eventually go back to families and achieve their destinies. How then can we ensure that we are educating people on ethical volunteering, making sure that we care for not just the future of the child, but also their present? Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Ruth. Well said. Okay, I want to go back to Bushan and then we'll finish with Barak. So, Bushan, in fact, you mentioned when you were speaking earlier about the Nepal earthquake, and in fact, it was just a few days ago, it was a 10-year anniversary of the 2015 Nepal earthquake. That brought back painful memories for me, as I'm sure it did for you and for everybody in Nepal. Now, during the Nepal earthquake, or after the Nepal earthquake, I should say, there was an outpouring of care and compassion for Nepal. People wanted to send donations. They wanted to help Nepal in its time of need. A lot of people wanted to come to Nepal to volunteer. Now, I know you were working very hard during this time for the relief efforts. What are your views about people who want to help a country in a time of need, like what happened in Nepal? Is coming over to a country like Nepal to volunteer, to work with orphans, is that a good thing? What's your views about the donations that were being given to Nepali orphanages with the view that there might be orphans after the earthquake? I'd love to hear your views on that and what you think best practice is in a situation like that.
Lovely. So right after earthquake, for some reason the whole world came together, and there were, like as you said, a lot of money coming. And the first instinct you have is like, this is beautiful. I have money to work on. I'm sorted out for a couple of years. That's lovely. And also with that comes a lot of people who wants to come and help. And again, the key word here is well-intentioned versus well-informed. Let me tell you an example, and I think I'll touch something that Ruth said earlier. I'm absolutely a big advocate for something has to change from a policy level. Like it has to be done, but there are certain things that has to be done on ground. I'll give you an example. There was a case. So Nepal is a country where there's a certain way that people dress, especially girls, women. They try to cover a lot of their body when they are wearing something. And like there were volunteers from the West who came there, and again, for some reason, they think going and like giving a hug to the kids is a good idea, which I'm absolutely up for. But also we noticed that there were a few teenagers in an orphanage, and given the hormones that their body was experiencing that time, that care of hug and the dress that they were wearing was meaning something else. And that first hug of what, we are with you, was slowly moving into, can I please get a hug again every morning that you see the person, or every evening that you go and meet a person. And kids were like initiating that hug, that touch, and everything. Again, there was nothing, like the intention was not wrong, but just that information dissemination on, yes, you're trying to do a good thing, but has that been taken in a right way? That took us to a moment where after a certain time, the kids were saying that, I really want to go to your country. And I looked into your Facebook. I saw your uncle had a business. I think I can work there. Right. So that was transitioning to something else that was happening there. Coming back to your point, Martin, it's not, it's a weird balance just to know on what you think you are doing, what you are doing, and what is that taking to a result. And like given like any crisis that comes, whether you talk about the earthquake that we had that brought a lot of people, again, I can think of several incidents where we almost had to save few volunteers from the community because they think, I'll tell you one more example if we have time. So after a long day at work, like they were in a school doing some work, they thought, it would be a great idea to go and take a shower in this cold river, a couple of like blocks down the road. So again, they being coming from a global, I mean, from the west side, they just went to a river, like change their clothes, and into their inner clothes, and like enjoy the river, enjoy the shower. And the whole community came down to a river saying that what in the world you are doing, right? Because that's not how our community is. We do not expose ourselves or a certain part of our body to the community. So the whole community came to the river being very angry, and understandably so. And we got to a situation where they were not trying to do anything harm, but the community did not take it the right way. So what I'm trying to say, Martin, here is, again, like just knowing what you're doing and what could be the result of that, and being very culturally responsive, whether it was like a Nepal's earthquake or anything down the road coming from there. I think like giving that understanding to the volunteer and like in general volunteerism world is very, very special, Martin.
Thank you, Bushan. You've explained that really clearly and given me some really good examples there about how people come and they really mean well. They really want to help, but they don't understand the culture, and there's no expectation to understand the culture. They've come over to help, and it shows that in reality, local people are best placed to work in a situation like that. And I think Barak also draws on some of those issues in his film about some of the young people who grew up in orphanages and are talking about volunteers drinking and socializing with them, and them saying, look, it was just completely inappropriate in Nepal, which shows the inappropriateness of that. And again, the volunteers don't mean ill intentions, but it doesn't translate well. It actually causes harm. So that's a really good example. Thank you very much. So I'm going to finish now with Barak. So you'll have the last word on this before we move on to the Q&A. And I'd love to hear, Barak, about what you're now doing with this film. I know you've been very busy. What are you doing how are you using the film to spread further awareness about this issue? And perhaps you could finish on just, if there was one message that you want people to take away from this event today, what would that message be?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So one thing I really want to touch on, what we're focusing on this film is creating change in the US. And a common question I get from people right here is, well, Nepal just needs to change their laws, for example, or the volunteers need to do more due diligence. So first, Nepal has laws. Cambodia has laws. All these countries have laws in order to make this illegal or prevent it. But the amount of wealth discrepancy, for example, when I was in Nepal, I'm not sure what it is now, a person working all day might only make $2 a day. At the same time, a volunteer was donating $100 a day to play with orphans, right? If you look at that in comparison of 50 times the amount of money, no amount of law is going to stop that kind of trafficking when there's that much money in it. And then the same with the volunteers. A lot of volunteers, they're nice people, they're good people, and there's an entire industry which is set up to give people wrong information, right? So if you were really smart, you do your due diligence and you go on Google and you search, what are the dangers of volunteering in an orphanage? You'll find dozens about why you shouldn't volunteer in orphanages and why children are trafficked. But if you search, where should I volunteer in an orphanage? There are dozens and dozens of sponsored listings that pay Google, that pay Bing to tell you how great you'll be if you volunteer in an orphanage. Um, that what you're doing is the right thing. And so what it's really going to take is legislation on the US side saying that there needs to be some sort of minimum standard. You could be a convicted sex offender and go and volunteer with any of these organizations. They don't background check. It's that should be a bare minimum, not to mention some level of training of being a mandated reporter or seeing what kind of trafficking is going on. And then similarly, these organizations that make all this money from trafficking children, they don't have to do any sort of yearly audit to make sure the kids aren't being trafficked, they're not being abused, that they're being reintegrated. I've personally seen an orphanage get closed down for human trafficking. The guy go to jail, get out because he paid the appropriate bribes, reopen another orphanage, and those same organizations are sending him people to a known child trafficker. So getting that changed is going to have to come from the US side. Right now, as you see, we're doing this campaign. We've gotten several proclamations signed in cities, and if someone is motivated, please contact your local mayor, councilman. all of my success has come from ambushing people. I got proclamations signed because I went to a fundraiser and pulled them aside. You know, sending an email, a phone call, it didn't necessarily help. So that's my big thing. And we have those resources on our webpage. If you just wanted to write a letter, if you go to our resources side, it'll have a pre-written letter you can send to your congressman or your councilman. I'm always happy to help. You know, this is such an important issue. The main takeaway I want people to have here is that this is largely a misinformation campaign. The knowledge is there is no debate on the expert side whether or not orphan trafficking and orphan tourism is good or bad. That's known by everybody. The only people who say, well, maybe, you know, it's a little better are the people who are profiting off of it, whether that's a nonprofit organization, which is knowingly or unknowingly trafficking children, if that's a church which makes money off of the donations, or if that's an orphanage which knows what it's doing is wrong but is making money off of it. Being aware that we can't trust the people who are making money off of children to tell us they know what's best for the children, and actually looking at what experts have to say, I think is the main and final takeaway. And if you encounter someone and you talk to them and they say, well, you know, my pastor said it's a good orphanage, or my uncle worked there, I have a neighbor and he really knows what he's talking about, you know, just take a second and take a step back and say, okay, every expert in the world says this is bad, you know, whether it's UNICEF or other NGOs, LUMOS, anyone who works with this issue, Freedom United will say, this isn't good. And like you said, Martin, there's no such thing as a good orphanage, right? That take a step back, don't listen to the people who are making money off of it, but look at what's actually going on and then trying to be part of the solution.
Thank you very much, Barak. I'm kind of reassured that you're out there ambushing people about this issue. You're moving it forward, and that's really good advice. That do you want to be on the side of the orphanage traffickers, or do you want to be on the side of the experts that really understand this issue? If I may, there's just one more point I want to add that I think has been brought up by a couple of, or two, all our speakers, in fact, which is just about volunteering generally. That I don't think our message today should be don't volunteer. Volunteering is great. We should all be out there volunteering and helping vulnerable communities, but just not orphanage volunteering. There's many other things you can do. Volunteering in your own country is great, where you are the expert, you know the culture. Volunteering, if you want to work for a children's organisation, volunteering in the back end, you know, help them redesign their websites, helping writing funding proposals. There's lots of stuff you can do in an office to do that. Or you can just go and visit a country like Nepal and contribute to the economy, learn about the country, speak to Nepalese who are the experts in their own country, learn from them about their culture, learn from people like Bushan about what he's doing or what Ruth is doing in Kenya. So just to end on a positive, there's lots that we can all do in the world to help children, but the best way of doing that is not through orphanage volunteering. Back to you, Ellie.
Thank you so much, Bhushan, Ruth, and Barak, and for doing a wonderful job moderating, Martin. I'm going to open up the Q&A now. So I'll start with a question that was asked anonymously, and then I will ask Dave for you to unmute yourself and ask your question, followed by Francis for you to unmute yourself and ask your question. Now I'll just read out the first anonymous question. A participant wrote, I live near an international border, so orphanage tourism is extremely common here. There are trips at least every weekend. It is very disturbing, the involvement of churches and nonprofits. However, I wanted to ask about groups that go under the guise of medical help. For example, medical students or doctors from other countries who go to orphanages. Is there a way that this can be ethical, or should it be changed? Is there someone for the panel that would feel comfortable answering this question?
To give that one a go, if it would help. Just to say that the same principle as what we've been talking about, really, that if you go to another country to help, and say you're an expert like a doctor or something, one of the best ways you can help is to go there and support other doctors and nurses and medical professionals. help them do their jobs better rather than trying to replace them, where you may not understand the culture. As a doctor, you may be prescribing medicines without knowing someone's full medical background. You may not know what medicines they've already been prescribed. It's actually quite problematic, medical volunteering, when people just go in and set up camps and just give out medicines and so on. It undermines local health systems. Where it's done well is when professionals like health professionals, or similarly in education, actually work with the existing health system or work with the existing education system and support the professionals that are already there. And I'd say medical professionals going to orphanages, no, it's the same old issue. It's just doing it under a different name. We shouldn't be supporting orphanages. We should be helping family-based services so that those children can be reunified with their families and go back to live in families. I don't know if anyone else has got anything to add to that.
Ruth, do you have
I
anything
could
to
add
add?
just one point, Martin. Yeah, I think I would still have said the same, but I do know that there's also a situation in Uganda where we had medical students traveling to an orphanage in Uganda and children died because they were not even qualified, and all they needed was an experience for them to have on their resume and say they volunteered around the world. So it's there, it's public information. You can check that and see that this actually did happen. And so let's support communities. Let's not become their saviors, but just let us enable them to literally take care of their children. If we can support doctors, like Martin said, that would be the best way, because when the communities lead on solutions, it's also very sustainable for them, because by the end of the day, we fly back to our families and tomorrow there's another child, a sick child. So really supporting the people on the ground to do the job and not replacing them, as Martin just mentioned.
That's a great point. I'm going to ask Dave Rossi to unmute himself. He should be given the option, and you can read your question out loud.
Yeah, one of the things in reading the law that I noticed was, despite it being like the 80%, 20%, there was nothing in there about differentiating legit orphans from kids in for-profit orphanages who have most likely been trafficked. So how does the law actually help to obtain evidence to do that differentiation? Because you can only support the good ones if you know what the bad ones are.
Maybe, Barak, you could explain a bit more of the purpose of the proposed TVPRA amendment. And also, I know that Bhushan and Martin, you touched on the idea of like a good orphanage or a bad orphanage. Maybe we could dive into the nuances there as well after.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, orphanage trafficking is completely legal and unregulated in the United States, and pretty much the entire world. There is no discrimination whatsoever. So one of the main things we're trying to do is amending the TVPR, and there's lots of ways to skin a cat here. So there may be other legal avenues, but what we're pushing for is to recognize orphan trafficking as a severe form of human trafficking, which it's currently not. So that would put it in with the other forms of modern slavery, sex trafficking, etc. One of those things we're hoping to do is to require that organizations which are sending volunteers or working with these vulnerable children would have to do some level of audit. So that way, if you go over there and you find out that these kids are being trafficked, right now, if you volunteer in an orphanage, this has happened, and you find out the kids are being trafficked, the NGO you paid thousands of dollars to go over there knew that the kids were being trafficked and didn't do anything. If you come back and sue them in the United States, they say you don't have any standing. They didn't do anything illegal and you don't have any right to sue. You know, sorry, you had a bad time. So getting a change there is really what we're pushing for. Now, I'll let Martin and Bhushan, go a little bit more into detail. I think, as I said, it's pretty much understood that there aren't good orphanages, and then you're probably not just you, most people aren't going to be qualified to understand if an orphanage is good or bad. You're going to go there for a week or two, and that guy makes a living by fooling people into believing that it's a good orphanage. That's his whole shtick. That being said, we're not trying to make all orphanages go away or all of them illegal. I think that's, a very arcing thing. We're starting to put in guide rails and protections to make sure that these places that do exist at least do some minor vetting of the Americans or the foreigners they're bringing over there, and also that there's a program that these kids who are being trafficked, can get home.
I mean, given the time, I think I'll pause because there's one more question which is dedicated to Nepal that if we get time, I'll respond to that one. But Martin, if you have anything to add, please go ahead.
Okay, Bhushan. Well, just to say that sometimes we get into this debate about real orphans and children who aren't orphans, and somehow if they're real orphans, then the orphanage is valid and so on. And it's not. It distracts us from the real issue. The reality is that if children are genuinely orphans, they've lost both parents. In most places around the world, it's very normal, including Nepal and Kenya. It's culturally very, very normal for those children to live with uncles, aunts, grandparents, other family members, older siblings, and so on. Extended families are the norm in most parts of the world outside of the Western world. So there's no reason why, again, those resources can't go towards helping those extended family members to care for those children. And if that's not possible, we look at foster care or we look at adoption. The children don't need to be in orphanages. Even if you're a genuine orphan, living in an orphanage or an institution is going to harm you. And we need to get those children into families. That's the kind of the key point, really. So there are orphanages out there where children haven't been trafficked and the people who care for the children are really good people and really kind people, and they're doing the best they can for those children. And they're obviously better than the abusive ones where children have been trafficked. But those children could still do 10 times, 20 times better if they're in a family. And actually, a lot of the work we do in trying to transition these systems, when we do find these supposedly kind of good orphanages with good people, we help those people to change what they do. So they end up reunifying children with families. They end up running family-based services. They support children in families. And I've worked in countless countries where I've seen governments do this really, really successfully, including Nepal and including Kenya. There's some great examples in Nepal and Kenya where organizations that used to run orphanages are now running services where they go out to the families and they help the families with the issues they're facing within the family unit, rather than taking their children away from them so they can serve the children there. So that's something to think about.
Ruth, did you have anything to add?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Yes, I wanted to say, as I was explaining, that I am a member of Association of Caregivers Networks in Africa, and these are young people or youth who have experiences growing up in the institutions, and there is a mix of all sorts of experiences. And when I say this, I mean, although we all grew up in institutional care, I'll say foster care, majority is institutional care. There are those who grew up in the physically well-run orphanages, and there are those who grew up in very bad run orphanages like ours, where, yes, majority of children had their parents, including myself, but we were made to lie and forget where we came from and falsify documents and lie to volunteers that we are orphans, etc. But one of the things that has come very closely as we interact is that although some grew up in the physically well run, the impact of institutionalization of children is still the same, because eventually they're expected to go back to community. They are lost. They have no identity. They are still having to face traumatic issues and look for access to mental health services because of the trauma of separation. And I say this because this is quite close to me, but I would combine this with research. I think there is enough research on how institutionalization of children impacts the development, but also even outcomes when you live. Because one of the things I find challenging is that, yes, we might say orphanages are okay, but we need to remember that you don't visit an orphanage and find a 60-year-old person in the orphanage. It tells you something, that eventually the exit But the question is, where do they go to and how is their life after that? So industrialization literally impacts them. So whether they had 3 meals a day, whether they were not abused, whether there was, it still impacts them the same way because it offers isolation. They're just isolated in that community, and eventually they are released or thrown into the world. We are crossing fingers that because of care reforms now that the exit will be done in a much, much better way, but it doesn't take away the impact. So no matter how well run an orphanage is, it doesn't replace the need for family, doesn't replace the need for love, but also the grounding that only a community or you being in a family setup can offer. Thank you. That's all I needed to add.
Thank you. Before we move on to the other questions, because we do have quite a few really good ones that I want to get to, I just want to say that the hour is up, but we are going to go over no longer than 15 minutes. So if you can, please do stick around. Finally, I know that some of you wanted to watch the film, but couldn't find the password that was sent to you in your inbox. And I apologize for that. The film will be up for one more day. And then we will change the password. So if it's okay with you, Brock, I'm going to share the password with everyone here. The password is volunteers, and I will share the Vimeo link. If you still want to watch the film, you will have one more day to do so, and I highly recommend that you do. Maybe I could get someone from the team to share the link in the chat and the password, so you have it written there. Now I will move on to, first I'll get Frances to read her question out loud because she is patiently waiting, and then I'll get Bhushan for you to answer the question on Nepal because I know that you want to get to that. So Frances, if you could ask your question now.
Yeah. In the 1990s, there was a lot of attention to what was called child laundering for the purposes of intercountry adoption. And I'm wondering, how does that intersect with what you're doing? If it's still happening or what's going on there? Thank you.
Someone want to tackle this question?
Yeah, I can tackle this one. So, this is an interesting topic, and I've learned a lot more about it because of my work. But originally this was a very big deal in Nepal, and you actually can't adopt children from Nepal anymore because so many of these children had been laundered. Currently, I believe Ukraine just stopped allowing adoptions outside of Ukraine. And I want to reiterate, a lot of times these things happen because of war, poverty. So, for example, in Ukraine right now, we know Russia is actually stealing children from Ukraine in the first place, so they're losing children that way. But a lot of parents in danger zones may send their kids to an orphanage because they'll be told, hey, your child could get bombed here, they could get shot here. There's an orphanage they can go to. There's somewhere safe in, let's say, Poland. And, then when the war is over, you can reintegrate with your children and they'll be warm and safe. At the same time, a lot of people in America really want to help the people of Ukraine because of what's happening. So they may spend tens of thousands of dollars, upwards $60,000 to $100,000 to adopt a child. So there's this huge economic driver. And so what was happening is these kids, some, as young as infants, may be adopted outside of, Eastern Europe and brought into the United States or other countries, and there may not be records. So Ukraine is kind of suspended or is talking about suspending these adoptions until they can ensure these kids aren't going to be trafficked away from their homes and never returned. And that's Ukraine is just what's happening now, but this happens pretty much everywhere there's a war zone or there's a major conflict.
I would just very briefly add to Barak's excellent answer there to say that in Nepal specifically, this problem have actually started around intercountry adoption. Children were being given fake birth certificates showing they were orphans, and well-meaning families from Western countries were adopting the children and taking them back home. And through various investigations by NGOs and so on, this industry, because it was an industry, was closed down and stopped. And that's when the traffickers decided to change and be innovative and decided, well, if we can't make money out of allowing inter-country adoptions for children that we're presenting as orphans and they're not orphans, we'll just put them in orphanages in Kathmandu and other tourist areas, and we'll bring the foreigners to Kathmandu and we'll charge them there. So that's trafficking innovation for you, which unfortunately is something traffickers are very good at.
And just to add on that one, and like also to answer a question that is posed there on what the government of Nepal is doing, like Nepal specific and South Asia in general. Well, my take on that one is, again, the traffickers always get innovative. They find a way to do like play around with the system. But my biggest concern is this gap between policy and practice. Like in policy, like the guideline is pretty clear on, how this orphanage should be run, like what kind of kids are allowed in an orphanage, who is like what a caretaker should know, what should be their qualification. So everything in paper is laid down there. If not everything, most of the thing is laid down there. But is it practice on the ground? Like, is it happening in an orphanage? Absolutely not. I mean, there are several orphanages where the caretaker have no kind of qualification to be a caretaker, right? So I mean, and I'm not like I give a lot of credit to them because they are taking their time, effort to take care of like so many children. But if something happens, like do they have enough resources or no? I mean, most of the cases they don't, right? And especially there has been cases where there were some medical issues, and it's such a bad thing to say, but like the orphanages are characterized, rich orphanage, poor orphanage, so who has a lot of money, who has a lot of volunteers, like they find a way to do something. The so-called, like, I mean, poor orphanages, they just like end up doing nothing to the kids. So my answer to that one is, in terms of policy, in terms of paper, it is in pretty decent amount. But while in terms of like implementation, in terms of like monitoring, few cases comes here and there, but I mean, it is not even close to what the standard should be.
Thank you, Bhushan. Do you have anything else to add, or was that also, you kind of answered the question that was directed? Okay, fabulous. So I will move on to another question that was asked by someone anonymously. I think a huge problem is the language the orphanages and nonprofits use to attract volunteers. They talk about children being abandoned and neglected, and the volunteers just accept that without knowing how children were removed from their homes. It is discouraging that people are attracted to volunteer by this propaganda. The film is a great effort to question the propaganda, but how else can it be countered? I saw Ruth, you nodding along. Perhaps you have something to add.
Yes, because language has stood in our way of justice for a long time, from the term orphanage to, using that to attracting volunteers to, again, this time now, say children were abandoned. I do think that we need to all rethink because, and this is going to call for all our collective efforts. And one of the things I like about Barack is how he's used art as a way to pass and break down very complex subject in a way that we can all relate, because films are very powerful. When I saw him featuring when he was interviewing the teacher on how much teachers are paid versus how much volunteers give, there is no better way to use language to express a more complex thing like that. And I think that we do think as a sector, as activists, as stakeholders, look at the orphanage issue as a justice issue and not a charity issue. And I'll put this forward. Nobody can govern how you give, how much you give to whoever you help, because that's literally you. It's for you to decide, who do I want to help in the community? How do I help them? And that is what we have done with orphanages. We just let people, whoever decides when, whether on a Monday or a Sunday, a mad person or a sane person, whether you're an abuser or not, you can literally go. And we need to regulate how children are taken care of. And to regulate, we must recognize that the lack of care and protection for children is not a charity issue, it's a child protection concern. And Martin, who's been doing this work for a long time, probably might have insights on how we need to go back to looking at it as this is not really to seek sympathy. These are children who are abandoned. Some are abandoned, some are not, but the separation is trafficking. Recognize that that is where it begins. That if we truly call this as not orphanage trafficking, I have a problem with that term as well, because when we say orphanage trafficking, again, we shift because of the language. But if we literally say that this is recruitment of children into institutional care for profit, the world will be forced to confront that because the power lies in how we are communicating. So we need to stop looking at orphanages as is charity. This is sympathy. This is no. We need to look at children who are in need of care and protection, being taken advantage of, and calling it for what it is. Then we'll be closer to getting justice from that point. Otherwise, you're not going to tell me that we are calling it residential care in some countries. At the same time, we are saying residential care is harmful to children. Why is it care then? Because care should be care, you know? So there's just a lot to unpack in terms of the movement and what we are hoping to achieve when it comes to language. I'll stop at that.
Just a really quick one to follow on from what Ruth's just said, that I would say to volunteers, if you really want to help, by all means go to these countries you're interested in. Go and actually learn about the countries from experts like Ruth and Bushan. They are the people that really understand what's happening in their countries, and they're running projects that they know how they're going to help. They know how to most effectively support vulnerable children. So if you want to support organisations like Reroute Africa and Reroute Africa, isn't it, Ruth, your organisation, and Kids of Kathmandu. That's the best way to help. And also go and learn about the country, engage in the culture, speak to the experts. There are organizations out there these days that can actually help you just go and learn and experience a country. It's called experiential learning or learning service. If you Google those terms, you'll find a lot of organizations out there that can support you with this. And that's actually much better in a way than trying to volunteer directly in another country, directly with children.
Thank you. I'm going to read out a question from Eileen Lau. I think that she had to leave, but this leads into another, something else I want to discuss is this will be recorded, and we will share this recording tomorrow, so that if you did have to leave or you do have to leave and you want to make sure that you get everything, keep an eye out. It will also sit on our site. And then Eileen also asks, is there a way to share the film? And are there other educational materials available that we can also share with adoption nonprofits in the US to help raise awareness, for example? We will send a follow-up email tomorrow, and our experts here are going to share some resources that they think you will find valuable for you to take a deeper dive into this issue and hopefully answer some other questions that you may have. And also, I know Barack mentioned earlier, if you want to have a showing of this film, for example, with your an organization that you're involved with, I know Eileen was asking how to help other organizations that they may be involved in, like, get awareness of this issue and help them understand like how they can vet orphanages or volunteerism placements. This would be a really great way. So I know that if you wanted to reach out to Brock, he would be more than happy to arrange a viewing with you, as he had mentioned before, but we will have the film available for one more day. So I hope that answers your question, Eileen. And then as a final comment before we wrap up, Moussom Boive said, and I think this is a really nice comment to end off on, is the webinar is an eye-opener for how large this phenomenon is globally. He says he's been facing this issue here in the DR Congo as he sees sick children having parents being turned as orphans and taking at public places for funds, raising money, and turning these children into a commodity. This is a nice way to sum up essentially what we've been talking about. just the commodification of children as the bottom line is essentially what we're talking about. And if there's any final comments from the panelists as a way to nicely wrap this up before I say some closing remarks. Yeah, all good. Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today's discussion. And thank you to the amazing, brilliant panel. I am so honored that you have given us your time and for helping me put on this event. And thank you to the Freedom United team for helping run this event. We will be sending out a recording tomorrow with the resources, as I mentioned. And also, if you would kindly consider donating to Freedom United so that we can keep having these events, that would be very appreciated. I will send over the link to donate in the chat. Thank you. I'll keep